In Alien Professor laughs at human's tiny knife, the climax erupts when a devastating plasma cyclone strikes early, shattering high-tech shelters across the training site. Mara, hearing a trapped Selvarian's cry for help, risks her own safety to venture into the raging storm. Using her primitive knife with methodical precision, she carves an escape route and carries the injured alien to safety in her humble, yet unbreakable shelter. The battered shuttle's landing struts scrape the obsidian plain of volcanic planet RX-9, kicking up crimson dust that swirled in the thin atmosphere before settling back onto the glass-hard surface. Cadet Mara Reed stood at the threshold of the open bay, squinting against the glare of twin suns reflecting off black cliffs in the distance. Her hand instinctively tightened around the worn handle of the chipped flint steel knife sheathed at her hip, her late mentor's heirloom and her only tool for the challenge ahead. Final checks complete. All cadets prepare for disembarkation, announced the shuttle's AI in its characteristic monotone. Atmospheric conditions, hostile. Temperature, 42 degrees Celsius. Wind speed, 22 kilometers per hour. Toxic particulate levels, moderate. Around Mara, 24 fellow cadets from across the galaxy secured breathing apparatus and made final adjustments to their equipment. A Selvarian cadet to her left calibrated a fusion cutter, its blue energy field humming with barely contained power. 2 stations down, a trio of insectoid X-Rith cadets chattered excitedly as they assembled a portable nanobot swarm control unit. Across the aisle, a hulking Terulian adjusted the power settings on a graviton saw capable of slicing through solid steel. Mara touched her knife's knucklebone handle and took a deep breath. The Galactic Survival Institute's legendary Obsidian trials were about to begin, and she was the only human in her class, the only cadet who hadn't embraced the Institute's philosophy of machine reliance for survival. "Commencing disembarkation," announced the AI. The ramp extended fully, and cadets began filing out onto the inhospitable surface of RX-9. Mara stepped onto the obsidian plane, her boots crunching on the brittle surface. Twin suns glared overhead, casting double shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the volcanic landscape. In the distance, steam vents hissed, releasing sulfurous plumes that rose into the copper-tinged sky. The air, even filtered through her breathing apparatus, carried the acrid tang of minerals and heat. At the base of a towering cliff face that rose like a black mirror from the plain, a small delegation of Institute faculty waited. At their center stood Professor Zelthar, a towering crystalline being whose faceted body refracted the sunlight into prismatic patterns across the ground. His reputation preceded him, the foremost survival specialist in the galaxy, and notorious for his disdain of primitive techniques. The cadets formed a semicircle before the faculty. Mara found herself positioned at the far edge of the formation, isolated both literally and figuratively from her tech-savvy peers. Professor Zelthar's voice resonated like crystal chimes struck with a hammer. "Welcome to RX-9, cadets. This desolate world will be your home, or your grave, for the next 72 hours. He paused, his crystalline eyes sweeping across the assembled students. "The Obsidian trials are simple in concept, but demanding in execution. Each of you will carve a shelter into the cliff face using only your personal tool. This shelter must withstand RX-9's extreme temperature fluctuations, provide protection against the predicted Class 5 plasma cyclone, and maintain atmospheric integrity." A murmur rippled through the group. Mara's stomach tightened. A Class 5 plasma cyclone wasn't scheduled for another 4 days, according to their briefing materials. "Yes," Zelthar continued. "The Institute has reclassified the approaching storm. It will arrive in approximately 68 hours. Consider this an additional challenge." His mouth, a line of crystalline fragments, formed what might have been a smile. "Failure to create an adequate shelter will result in your immediate expulsion from the Institute. Survival is the only metric that matters here." The professor began moving among the cadets, inspecting their equipment and offering terse comments. He paused before the Selvarian with the fusion cutter, nodding approvingly. Excellent choice. Thermal efficiency at 97%. He spent several minutes examining the X-Rith nanobots, asking pointed questions about their programming and adaptation algorithms. Impressive. Self-learning excavation patterns. When he reached Mara, the professor's crystalline body seemed to stiffen. He extended a faceted finger and tapped the handle of her knife, producing a hollow knock. "And what Cadet Reed is this?" Mara stood at attention. "A flint steel composite blade. Professor, my mentors. It served for 17 Earth years of field expeditions." Professor Zelthar's crystalline form vibrated, a sound Mara recognized as laughter. The vibration grew, spreading to the other faculty members, until the professor threw his head back and bellowed, "Your pebble chisel, prehistoric!" The laughter spread to the other cadets. Even the shuttle's AI emitted a synthesized chuckle. "Humans," Zelthar continued, addressing the group now, rather than Mara directly. "Always clinging to their ancestors' stones while the galaxy evolves around them." He turned back to Mara. "The Institute expected better from you, Cadet. Perhaps your acceptance was premature." Mara's cheeks burned, but she kept her gaze level. "With respect, Professor, this pebble chisel has saved lives on 7 worlds." "Has it now?" Zelthar's crystalline features rearranged into an expression of mock interest. "Well, Cadet Reed, let us see if your prehistoric tool can save your academic career." He gestured toward the cliff. "Your assigned sector is Grid 47. Mara's heart sank. Grid 47 was notorious, a sheer wall of fused glass ridges, notorious for its resistance to even industrial cutting tools. It was either a cruel joke or a deliberate setup for failure. "Stations will be marked with beacon drones," the professor continued, addressing all cadets now. "You have 68 hours until storm arrival. Begin." The group dispersed, each cadet moving toward their assigned grid. Mara walked alone to the far end of the cliff face, where a small drone hovered, projecting the number 47 in glowing blue numerals against the obsidian wall. She surveyed her workspace. The cliff rose 20 meters above her, its surface a complex lattice of volcanic glass and fused minerals. Vertical ridges protruded at irregular intervals, creating natural buttresses that caught the light of the twin suns and scattered it in dazzling patterns. Mara unsheathed her knife and knelt before the wall. The blade, 15 centimeters of composite flint steel, looked absurdly small against the towering expanse of obsidian. From nearby stations came the whine of graviton saws, the hiss of fusion cutters, and the electric hum of sonic drills. Mara took a deep breath, focusing on the wall before her rather than the cacophony of advanced technology surrounding her. She placed her hand against the obsidian surface, feeling its texture through her thin protective gloves. The outer layer was smooth, but not uniform. Microscopic variations in density and composition created a barely perceptible topography beneath her fingertips. Mara closed her eyes, letting her hand guide her perception. There, a slight depression, a natural seam in the rock. She opened her eyes and brought her knife to the seam, pressing the tip into the slight groove. With controlled pressure, she dragged the blade along the line, testing the resistance. The knife barely scratched the surface, leaving the faintest of marks in its wake. Mara nodded to herself. This would be slow work, but not impossible. She retrieved a water flask from her pack and took a careful sip. Conservation would be essential. The Institute had provided each cadet with only the minimum required for survival. For the remainder of the first day, Mara methodically explored the obsidian face, creating a detailed mental map of its weaknesses. She identified 3 potential entry points, where natural fissures might be exploited, and tested each with careful strokes of her knife. By sunset, a spectacular double-dipping of the twin suns below the horizon, She had managed to create a series of shallow guide marks, but nothing resembling the beginnings of a shelter. As darkness fell, bringing with it a precipitous drop in temperature, Mara erected a small emergency tent at the base of the cliff. The transparent dome, designed for temporary use only, would offer minimal protection against the coming storm. All around her, other cadets had made significantly more progress. The Silverian's fusion cutter had already hollowed out a cavity large enough to stand in, while the X-Rith nanobots had excavated a perfectly geometric entryway. Mara ignored the occasional glances from her fellow cadets, some curious, others smug. She ate a small portion of her rations, reviewed her notes, and slept in short cycles, waking periodically to check her surroundings and plan her approach for the coming day. Dawn arrived with brutal suddenness, the twin suns cresting the horizon simultaneously and instantly bathing the landscape in scorching light. Mara was already awake, kneeling before the cliff face, knife in hand. Today, she would focus on a single seam, the most promising of the three she had identified yesterday. It ran diagonally across the section of wall assigned to her, from approximately 2 meters above ground level to nearly 4 meters high. The seam wasn't immediately visible to the naked eye, but Mara had detected it through touch and the subtle way it altered the reflection of light. She began with short, precise strokes, gradually increasing pressure as she better understood the material's resistance. The knife's edge bit millimeters deeper with each pass, clearing away microscopic particles of obsidian dust. Mara worked methodically, moving her body to maintain optimal leverage, stopping only to sip water or wipe sweat from her brow. By midday, she had created a groove approximately 2 centimeters deep along a 1-meter section of the seam. It was barely visible progress compared to the cavernous openings being created by her peers. But Mara remained focused on her task. From the station to her right came a sudden shower of sparks, followed by a stream of curses in Silverian. Mara glanced over to see the fusion cutter sputtering and dying, its energy field collapsing. "Thermal regulation failure," the Silverian muttered, frantically adjusting controls on the device's handle. "The composition is interfering with the plasma containment." Mara returned to her work, noting the information but maintaining her rhythm. Similar incidents occurred throughout the afternoon. The graviton saw overheated, requiring a 2-hour cooldown. One of the sonic drills fractured its primary oscillator. Even the nanobots encountered difficulties, becoming trapped in microscopic pores within the obsidian matrix. As the second day progressed, Mara made a critical discovery. Hidden within her chosen seam was a vein of volcanic ash, a softer material embedded within the harder obsidian. With careful manipulation, she could remove this ash, creating a deeper channel that would allow her to exploit structural weaknesses in the surrounding rock. Her knife moved with increasing confidence, each stroke now yielding visible results. The groove deepened to 5 centimeters, then 8, then 12. By late afternoon, Mara had created a narrow but significant channel along the entire length of the seam. She became aware of silence to her left. The trio of insectoid X-Rith cadets had paused their work to watch her. Their compound eyes reflected the sunlight as they observed her methodical progress. "Inefficient," one of them clicked in their native language, which Mara understood from her xenolinguistics training. "Yet effective," responded another. "The human uses the rock's natural structure." "Slow," added the third. "Consistent," countered the second. Mara acknowledged them with a nod but didn't break her rhythm. The knife moved in a steady pattern. Press, drag, lift, clear, repeat. Press, drag, lift, clear, repeat. By sunset of the second day, Mara had created a narrow opening approximately 20 centimeters wide and 40 centimeters deep at its maximum point. It was barely large enough to insert her arm up to the elbow, but it followed the natural weakness in the rock for nearly 2 meters. More importantly, She had confirmed that the ash vein extended deeper into the cliff, potentially providing a path to hollow out a larger cavity. That night, as temperatures plummeted once again, a series of seismic tremors shook the plain. The vibrations were minor, barely registering on the Institute's monitoring equipment, but they were enough to disrupt the calibration of many of the cadets' tools. Mara awoke to the sound of frustrated voices and the beeping of diagnostic systems. The tremors had another effect, one that only Mara noticed when she resumed work at first light. The seismic activity had widened her carefully carved channel by several millimeters and created new stress fractures branching from the main seam. It was as if the planet itself was assisting her efforts. Taking advantage of this development, Mara modified her approach. Using a metal tent pole as a wedge and her knife as a lever, she began carefully prying loose sections of obsidian that had been weakened by the tremors. Each piece came free with a satisfying crack, accelerating her progress dramatically. By midday, she had created an opening large enough to insert her upper body. The interior space followed the ash vein in 3 dimensions, creating a natural cavity that Mara was carefully enlarging. Her hands were raw despite her gloves, and small cuts on her fingers left smears of blood on the obsidian surface. She wrapped strips of cloth around the worst injuries, but continued working without pause. Around her, the technological failures multiplied. The Selvarian's fusion cutter had completely malfunctioned, forcing them to switch to a backup plasma torch with significantly less cutting power. The X-Rith nanobots were operating at reduced efficiency, confused by the complex mineral structure of the cliff face. Even the graviton saw, initially so effective, was struggling to maintain consistent power levels as the seismic activity interfered with its quantum stabilizers. Professor Zelthar made periodic rounds, offering technical advice to struggling cadets and monitoring overall progress. He passed Mara's station without comment, though she felt his crystalline gaze linger on her bloodied hands and the modest opening she had created. By the end of the 3rd day, with less than 24 hours remaining before the predicted arrival of the plasma cyclone, Mara had hollowed out a cavity approximately 1.5 meters wide, 1 meter high, and 2 meters deep. It was small compared to the cavernous shelters created by some of her peers, but it was aligned with the natural structure of the rock and reinforced by the existing buttresses of the cliff face. Most importantly, Mara had discovered that the ash vein connected to a small natural chamber deeper within the cliff, a volcanic bubble formed millennia ago when the planet's surface was still molten. This chamber would provide additional space and, potentially, natural ventilation through tiny fissures that extended further into the rock. That night, seismic activity increased. Minor tremors became more frequent, and monitoring equipment detected a sharp rise in electromagnetic disturbances in the upper atmosphere. The plasma cyclone was accelerating, approaching faster than predicted. Mara spent the night in her partially completed shelter, testing its stability during the tremors and marking weak points that required reinforcement. She slept in short bursts, waking to continue her work by the light of a small emergency lamp. Dawn of the 4th day brought ominous skies. The copper hue had darkened to a deep bronze, and electrical discharges flickered between cloud layers. The Institute's monitoring systems issued updated warnings. The plasma cyclone would make landfall in approximately 12 hours, far earlier than the already accelerated timeline. An emergency meeting was called. Professor Zelthar addressed the cadets, his crystalline form vibrating with tension. "The situation has deteriorated," he announced without preamble. "The cyclone will reach us by sunset. All shelters must be completed and sealed within 10 hours. Faculty will conduct final inspections before storm arrival." Cadets returned to their stations with renewed urgency. Tools whined and hummed at maximum capacity. Emergency power units were deployed to boost the capabilities of faltering equipment. Mara worked with quiet intensity, focusing on reinforcing the entrance to her shelter and smoothing the interior surfaces to prevent injury. She created a series of baffles near the opening, angled projections of rock that would deflect wind and pressure waves while still allowing air circulation through the natural fissures she had discovered. By mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened to a menacing purple-black. Electrical discharges had become continuous, creating a constant flicker of light across the obsidian plain. Wind speeds had increased to over 100 kilometers per hour, and particulate levels in the atmosphere had risen beyond the safe operational parameters of many electronic systems. Faculty members began their inspections, moving quickly from station to station. When Professor Zelthar reached Mara's shelter, he peered inside with obvious skepticism. "This is your final submission, Cadet Reed?" Mara nodded, standing beside the modest opening she had created. "Yes, Professor." Zelthar inserted a monitoring device into the cavity. The device projected a holographic display showing structural integrity, atmospheric composition, and projected resistance to various stresses. The professor's crystalline features rearranged in what might have been surprise as he studied the readings. "Interesting approach to ventilation," he murmured, almost to himself. "Natural convection currents through existing fissures." Without further comment, he moved on to the next station, leaving Mara uncertain whether her shelter had passed inspection or not. An hour before sunset, the storm's leading edge became visible on the horizon, a wall of swirling energy, purple-black and shot through with electrical discharges that forked like luminous veins across the sky. Wind speeds had reached 300 kilometers per hour, tearing at emergency tents and equipment that hadn't been properly secured. The order came to seek shelter. Cadets scrambled to make final adjustments before retreating into their carved sanctuaries. Mara slipped into her modest cavity, securing a reinforced thermal blanket across the opening to provide additional protection against wind and particulate matter. Inside, the space was cramped but functional. Mara could sit upright or lie down with her knees bent. The natural chamber she had discovered provided enough additional space to store her pack and equipment. Most importantly, the natural ventilation system was functioning as she had hoped. Fresh air circulated through microscopic fissures in the rock, regulated by the pressure differentials she had created with her system of baffles. The storm hit with apocalyptic fury. Even through meters of solid obsidian, Mara could feel the impact as the plasma cyclone made landfall. The ground shook. The air pressure fluctuated wildly, making her ears pop. Temperature rose sharply as ionized particles in the storm front interacted with the planet's magnetic field. Through a small gap in her thermal blanket, Mara could see the devastation unfolding on the plain. Equipment that hadn't been secured was thrown hundreds of meters by the hurricane-force winds. Electrical discharges struck the cliff face, leaving scorch marks and occasionally melting the obsidian surface into new, twisted formations. Most concerning were the sounds of failure echoing through the cliff. The distinctive crack of structural collapse, the hiss of atmospheric breach, the frantic beeping of emergency systems. Mara monitored the conditions in her shelter using simple tools: a pressure gauge, a thermometer, a handheld atmospheric analyzer. The temperature fluctuated, but remained within survivable parameters. The pressure stabilized as her baffle system adapted to the external changes. The air remained breathable, cycling through the natural fissures exactly as she had planned. A particularly violent tremor shook the cliff, dislodging a shower of obsidian fragments from the ceiling of Mara's shelter. She covered her head with her arms, feeling the sting as sharp edges cut through her protective clothing. When the shower subsided, Mara heard something new, a faint call for help. It was coming from the station adjacent to hers, where the Selvarian cadet had carved an impressively large cavity, using the fusion cutter before it malfunctioned. Mara pressed her ear to the side wall of her shelter. The call came again, more desperate this time. The Selvarian's shelter was failing. Without hesitation, Mara gathered her emergency lamp and knife. She secured her breathing apparatus, wrapped the thermal blanket around her body for protection, and prepared to leave the relative safety of her shelter. The moment she pulled aside the blanket covering her entrance, the full force of the storm hit her. Wind tore at her protective gear, threatening to rip the blanket from her grasp. Electrical discharges illuminated the scene in strobing flashes of purple-white light. The air was thick with particulate matter that scoured any exposed skin like sandpaper. Mara pressed herself against the cliff face, using the natural buttresses as shields as she made her way laterally toward the Silverian station. The distance was only about 10 meters, but in the fury of the plasma cyclone, it might as well have been a kilometer. She reached the Silverian shelter to find its entrance partially collapsed. A section of ceiling had fallen, trapping the cadet inside. Through the remaining opening, Mara could see the Silverian's face, contorted in pain and fear. "Help!" the Silverian gasped, their voice barely audible above the howling wind. "My leg. Trapped." Mara assessed the situation quickly. The collapsed section was too heavy to move directly, but the fracture pattern suggested it might be possible to create a larger opening adjacent to the collapse. "Stay still," she shouted to the Silverian. "I'm going to cut you out." Using her knife with the same methodical precision she had employed for the past 3 days, Mara began working on the obsidian around the collapsed entrance. The storm conditions made the work infinitely more difficult. Wind threatened her balance. Particulate matter obscured her vision, and electrical discharges created the constant risk of sudden death. Nevertheless, she persisted. Press, drag, lift, clear, repeat. Press, drag, lift, clear, repeat. The rhythm that had served her for days continued to serve her now. After 20 minutes of intense effort, Mara had created an opening large enough to reach the Silverian. The cadet's leg was pinned beneath a slab of obsidian, but the injury appeared to be a simple fracture rather than a crushing wound. "I need to move the slab," Mara explained. "It's going to hurt, but I'll be quick." The Silverian nodded, bracing themselves against the pain to come. Mara inserted her knife beneath the slab, using it as a lever while she applied counterpressure with her shoulder. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden shift, the slab moved just enough for the Silverian to pull their injured leg free. "Can you move?" Mara asked, already assessing whether the cadet could make it to her shelter. The Silverian tested their injured leg, wincing. "With support, yes. My shelter is 10 meters that way," Mara pointed. "It's small but stable. We need to move now." Supporting the injured cadet, Mara led the way back along the cliff face. The return journey was even more treacherous, with the Silverian's weight threatening their balance with each step. Twice, they nearly fell as particularly violent gusts of wind slammed them against the rock. Finally, they reached Mara's shelter. She helped the Silverian inside first, then followed, securing the thermal blanket across the entrance once more. The space, already tight for one person, was extremely cramped with two. The Silverian's tall, slender body had to contort uncomfortably to fit within the confines of the cavity. "Not exactly luxury accommodations," the Silverian commented, their voice tight with pain, but carrying a note of genuine gratitude. "It's not pretty, but it works," Mara replied, already attending to the cadet's injured leg. She used strips torn from her own clothing to create a makeshift splint, stabilizing the fracture. Through the long hours of the night, the storm raged unabated. Temperatures outside dropped to -40 degrees Celsius as the cyclone's trailing edge passed over their position. Electrical activity intensified, with discharges striking the cliff face with increasing frequency. Inside the small shelter, Mara and the Silverian monitored conditions and rationed their combined supplies. The natural ventilation system, designed for one occupant, struggled to maintain optimal atmospheric conditions for two, but it continued to function. "Your knife," the Silverian said during a relative lull in the storm's fury. "I thought it was a joke when Professor Zelthar laughed at it. Now I understand." Mara glanced at the blade, its edge now noticeably dulled from days of work against the obsidian. It's not about the tool. It's about understanding the material you're working with. A lesson many of us failed to learn, the Silverian acknowledged. Our technology worked against the rock, not with it. Dawn arrived with eerie suddenness as the storm finally passed, revealing a transformed landscape. The obsidian plain was scoured clean of all unsecured equipment. Several sections of the cliff face showed signs of electrical damage, melted channels and vitrified surfaces where repeated lightning strikes had altered the rock's composition. Mara and the Silverian emerged from their shelter to find rescue drones already hovering over the plain, their medical scanners sweeping the cliff face for signs of life. KV Automed units moved among the stations, extracting injured cadets from damaged shelters or checking the vital signs of those who had weathered the storm successfully. Of the 24 shelters carved into the cliff, fewer than half remained structurally intact after the plasma cyclone. The rest had collapsed completely or suffered catastrophic breaches that would have proven fatal in a non-training environment. Professor Zelthar stood atop the ridge, his crystalline form gleaming in the light of the rising twin suns. Faculty members conferred around him, gesturing toward various stations and consulting holographic displays of storm data. A medical drone approached Mara and the Silverian, scanning their vital signs and paying particular attention to the splinted leg. Cadet Tevik requires medical evacuation for a complex tibial fracture, the drone announced in a clinical tone. Stabilization adequate, tissue damage minimal, probability of full recovery, 93%. Another drone arrived to transport the Silverian, Tevik, to the medical shuttle that had landed on the far side of the plane. Before being lifted away, Tevik grasped Mara's hand. "Thank you, Cadet Reed. I will not forget." Mara nodded, watching as the Silverian was carried away for treatment. She turned her attention to her shelter, examining it in the clear light of morning. The small cavity showed remarkably little damage, a few new cracks along the ceiling, some erosion around the entrance, but nothing that compromised its fundamental integrity. Professor Zelthar descended from the ridge, moving methodically from station to station. He spent several minutes at each location, recording observations and occasionally extracting samples of rock for later analysis. When he reached Mara's station, a crowd had gathered, faculty members and cadets alike, curious about the shelter that had not only survived, but had proven spacious enough to accommodate a second person in emergency conditions. Zelthar ducked his head to peer into the modest opening. His crystalline body refracted the morning light, casting rainbow patterns across the interior surfaces. He remained silent for a long moment, scanning every detail of Mara's work. Finally, he straightened and turned to address the assembled observers. His voice rang out across the plain, amplified naturally by the crystalline structure of his body. "Cadets, faculty, observe and learn. This shelter represents the highest principles of survival engineering." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. "Not because of its size or aesthetic appeal," Zelthar continued, "but because of its fundamental alignment with natural principles. Cadet Reed did not impose her will upon the obsidian. She discovered its will and cooperated with it." He turned to Mara, his crystalline features arranged in what she now recognized as an expression of respect. "The Institute commendations will reflect this achievement. Perfect scores in innovation, endurance, and leadership. Furthermore, the principles demonstrated here will be codified in the Institute's training manuals for future classes." Mara stood at attention, acutely aware of the blood-stained bandages on her hands, the tears in her protective clothing, and the exhaustion that made her body feel leaden. "Thank you, Professor," she said simply. "No, Cadet Reed. It is I who must thank you." Zelthar's voice took on a different quality, less formal, more personal. "You have reminded an old crystalline being that technology is a tool, not a solution. The most sophisticated excavation system cannot replace the wisdom to know where and how to dig. The evacuation procedures began shortly thereafter. Injured cadets were transported to orbital medical facilities, while those who had weathered the storm successfully assisted faculty in collecting data and samples from the site. Mara was among the last to leave the surface. Before boarding the shuttle, she returned to her shelter one final time. She placed her hand against the obsidian surface, feeling the coolness of the rock against her palm. "Thank you," she whispered to the cliff that had sheltered her, words meant for no ears but her own. Weeks later, Mara stood in the Institute's artifact hall, a vast chamber where historically significant tools and devices were displayed for the education of future cadets. A new installation had been unveiled that morning, a simple glass dome beneath which rested her flint steel knife. The blade showed the wear of its ordeal on RX-9. The once sharp edge was dulled and chipped in places. The knucklebone handle was stained with her blood, yet it retained a quiet dignity, a testament to simplicity and efficacy. Beneath the dome, a small plaque carried an inscription. "When all machines failed, one knife carved hope from stone." Mara read the words in silence, remembering the feel of the knife in her hand, the rhythm of her work against the obsidian cliff, the moment when she had decided to risk her own safety to save Tevik. Professor Zelthar appeared beside her, his crystalline body humming softly with the harmonic vibrations that indicated thoughtfulness in his species. "The Selvarian cadet, Tevik, has requested assignment to your next expedition team," he informed her, "as have 7 others who witnessed your work on RX-9. Mara nodded, unsurprised. The experience had changed something among her peers, a shift in perspective that valued understanding over technological advantage. "Will you accept these assignments?" Zelthar asked. "Yes," Mara replied, "but with one condition." "Name it." "Each team member brings a knife." She smiled slightly. "In addition to whatever other tools they prefer." Zelthar's crystalline form vibrated with what Mara now recognized as laughter. Not the mocking sound from their first encounter, but something warmer, more appreciative. "Already approved," he said. "The requisition orders were processed this morning. The finest bladesmiths in the Institute are at work as we speak." Mara turned from the display case, her mind already focusing on the next assignment, a survey mission to the ice caverns of Epsilon Eridani 4. She would need different techniques there, different approaches to working with the frozen environment. But the principles would remain the same: observe, understand, adapt. Work with nature rather than against it. Recognize that technology, no matter how advanced, was only as effective as the wisdom guiding its use. As she walked from the artifact hall, Mara touched the empty sheath at her hip, a temporary absence soon to be filled by a new blade. The knife itself might be displayed beneath glass, but its lesson had been carved permanently into the Institute's consciousness. Proof that instinct and ingenuity endure where technology cannot.